L'kutus is Chelek Yud Ches, Balak Gimel, Lili Nishmis Reb Yosef ben Yamin ben Reb Menashe Kaltman, a fascinating insight into the dialogue or the one-way conversation between Zimri ben Salu and Moshe Rabbeinu with regards to Moshe Rabbeinu's wife and Moshe Rabbeinu's marriage, with a beautiful and powerful lesson with regards to our own lives and the connection with Yud Beis Tammuz. At the end of our Sedra, with the story which goes as follows: Zimri ben Salu, as we're going to see in a moment, comes to challenge Moshe Rabbeinu. The Gemara says that there was a complaint that Moshe was allowing the Yidden to kill the worshippers of Baal Pa'or, but Zimri comes to challenge Moshe Rabbeinu. The pasuk says a man from amongst the Jewish people came, and he came with his brothers, and he brought this Midianite woman before Moshe. The Chazal and the Gemara in Sanhedrin tell us the story, and they say like this: as Zimri ben Salu di Midianis, Kazvi Basur gebracht for Moshe Rabbeinu. Kazvi Basur was a princess, a Midianite princess, and Zimri brings her before Moshe, and claims and asks and challenges, Zu Asuroi Muteres, is this woman permitted to me or forbidden to me? If you're going to say that she's not Jewish, and therefore I'm not allowed to marry her, Bas Yisrei mi'itir lecha, who allowed you to marry, who permitted you to marry Bas Yisrei? Yisrei was Kohen Midyan, his daughter would have been a Midianite woman, Tzipoira. How could Moshe Rabbeinu marry a Midianite woman? At the moment Moshe, it escaped him. Moshe forgot what the halacha is. Bizas Pinchas Ra Ma'isa, until Pinchas saw that what was going on, v'nizkir halacha, and remembered the halacha that he learned from Moshe Rabbeinu from Sinai, habayel kutzis kanoim peikin bay, that someone who cohabits with a non-Jewish woman, zealots or avengers, are allowed to take matters into their own hands, which is the halacha is that if it came before Bezdin, they wouldn't necessarily paskin, they wouldn't rule this way. But if it's in the heat of the moment, and a person is a kanoi, a person is legitimately a zealot, he's allowed to take matters into his own hands, and that's what happened. Pinchas kills Zimri and Cosby together. And as we know from Parshas Pinchas, Pinchas is rewarded for this bravery. But what's this take basistig and muteres Moshe Rabbeinu? So now the question is, what is the answer to Zimri's question? Why is Yisrei's daughter allowed to marry Moshe Rabbeinu? Is Rashi Masbir? Rashi in the Gemara over there explains in Sanhedrin, Moshe Kedem Matan Torah Nasa. Moshe got married before Matan Torah. Ukishanit not Torah. And when Torah was given, Kulan b'nei Noyachayu, they were all considered non-Jews up until the giving of the Torah. And when the Torah was given, they all joined under the obligation of mitzvahs. In other words, they converted in one way or another way. In the Haaretz, there's a lot of discussion about this, and we're going to stay in the Pnim. But what exactly it means, was it a total giur? Was it not a total giur? But regardless, the Yidden had to go through a process of entering under the wings of the Shekhinah. V'hi imahem, and Tzipora was with them, and therefore, by the time we get to this part of the story, Tzipora is a giyora, she's a convert, and she's allowed to marry Moshe Rabbeinu. This is Moshe knows Tzipora. Val demol far Matan Torah zanalech dibnei Yisrael gven together from Menach. Moshe married Tzipora because before Matan Torah, all the Yidden were in the category of non-Jews. Und nach Matan Torah zechech Tzipora megay given zusammen mit alle Yidden. By Matan Torah, Tzipora converted together with all of the Yidden. Und der Vater zech der nach Muteres zu Moshe, and therefore she's permissible Moshe is allowed to marry her. It's very simple. Is nit move on, but because it is so simple, we're going to ask the question. Zimri was a nasi. He was a leader of a family. He was a leader of a tribe, depending on the various opinions. He wasn't a simpleton. Why was he challenging that? How could you marry the daughter of Yisrael? Sie denot nicht gewusst dem Chelek hachi pashet zwischen Nisuin from Matan Torah nach Matan Torah. Did Zimri not realize the simple distinction between before Matan Torah and after Matan Torah? That before Matan Torah they were all non-Jews, halachically speaking, and after Matan Torah they were all Gedim. And we could ask the question in the other direction as well. If for some reason you would say that this is not a sufficient reason, the fact that she was nisgayer by Matan Torah is not good enough, even if you were to suggest it that way, is nachal shver. Then we have a question the other way. Was mir gefindet in Gemara, as Moshe did mit anders, soll entweder auf der Teine von Zimri. Klappe Moshe Rabbeinu. Why don't we find that anybody responded to Zimri on this specific challenge? Pinchas a place gesagt die Halacha habayal aramish chulu. Was it negate to Ma'ase Zimri? Pinchas mentioned the halacha that's with regards to the act, the deed that Cosby was engaged, that Zimri was engaged in. He was engaged in an act of bayal aramis. He was cohabiting in front of everyone with a aramis, a midyanis, with a non-Jewish woman, and therefore he mentioned halacha with regards to that. But no one answered Zimri's question: how Taka could Moshe Rabbeinu marry a tzipayra? So either the question is, how does Zimri not realize that there's no problem, and if there is some sort of problem, why doesn't anyone address it? As Adam Farshim was sagen, as das Gufa, der Chilek Hanal zwischen Fahrt und nach Matan Torah is nis alma from Moshe. So there are certain Mefarshim that want to suggest that is exactly what Moshe forgot. Even though it escaped Moshe. That before Matan Torah, not Matan Torah is very, very different. That's what it means, this alma from Moshe. Should have been a simple thing. And Moshe had a blank, was drawing a blank. But this the Rebbe says here is an insufficient explanation. You can't use that. Why? First of all, Rashi says clearly which halacha did he forget? The halacha that abayil kusis, that someone who cohabits with a Gentile woman, the avengers could take, the zealots can take matters into their own hands. As blaze di halacha, was for an enish as kumt is nis alma menu. With this detail, what punishment is given to a bayal kusis or a bayal aramis, that is what was forgotten by Moshe Rabbeinu. That's problem number one. Beis, it's very difficult to say that something like this Moshe should forget. If it's something, a kanoim pagan boy, it's a very unique halacha, you could say, we know it was in order for Pinchas to be able to take schar, it was actually ordained from Hashem. But to say that he forgot a not well-known halacha, fine. But something that's so basic, to say that Moshe forgot, is a very unrealistic thing. But in addition to these two things, number one, Rashi says that he forgot the halacha of Abayel Kusis. Number two, it's hard to say that Moshe forgot such a basic thing. Is Eichnet Ruvan? There's a much bigger question. Wie hat Zimri gefragt as a Shaila? How could Zimri even ask this question? Hat sich denn gekannt verlassen as von Moshe that nis allem während der Chiluk zwischen Pharaoh and nach Matan Torah? Let's understand. Zimri was trying to challenge Moshe Rabbeinu. He was trying to embarrass him. He was trying to bring out something in Moshe. You married a Midyanis. Abbas Yisrael. So if he was to ask the question, how could you marry Yisrael's daughter? He had to expect that Moshe is going to answer, well, she was this guy. It's after Matan Torah now. How could Zimri feel that he has this major challenge to Moshe Rabbeinu if the answer is so simple? Could he have expected, could he have expected, could he have relied upon the fact that Moshe would forget this? This whole concept, he didn't even know of this idea of Nisal Mimenu. So therefore to say that that Nis'alma Mimenu is referring to the halacha of the difference between before and after Matan Torah is very difficult in the flow of this story. So we back to our initial question: either what was Zimri's question, or if Zimri does have a good question, why doesn't anybody answer his question? In Sif Beis, we're going to bring in a separate question that we have on the story. Ich darf verstehen. Der din is as a giyaris is asura lakayin. The din is that a giyaris is asur to be married to a kayin. A kayin is not allowed to marry a giyaris. Even a kayin hedyot is allowed to marry a gerusha, and is allowed to marry not a gerusha, an almana. Is not allowed to marry a giyaris. Und das is an isur min haTorah. It's not just something that came later, but it's actually a isur midayraisa. Hagam the Gemara learned this up from a pasuk in Yecheskel. Even though the Gemara learns this from a pasuk in Yecheskel, it says that the besules mizera Yisrael from the Jewish lineage. So from this we learn that a giyaris is also to a kohen. Is das nor was also Yecheskel v'asmecha akroi. So Tosfos in that Gemara over there says that it's not really from Yecheskel, because that would mean that it's not midayraisa. It was really already asur min haTorah, but it wasn't so clear necessarily. So Yecheskel came and he made a pasuk for it, so that we could see it explicitly in the pasuk in Yecheskel. But really, it's asur midayraisa. Why? But that's an isur min haTorah. Truly, it is an isur midayraisa. Isha zeina geimer lo yikachu. One of the types of women that a kohen is not allowed to marry is a zeina, a prostitute. And therefore, a giyaris, lefisha ba mina aku mashtufim bezima. Since a giyaris comes from the other nations that are immersed in immorality, therefore they are in the halacha category of zayna, and therefore, even though they are a giyaris and they're a full-fledged Jewess, nevertheless, to a kohen, they're not allowed to get married. So this is detail number one. Now let's bring in another detail that's going to lead us to our question. In the Gemara is the Aplukta vegen Moshe Rabbeinu. There's an argument in the Gemara in Zvachim with regards to the status of Moshe Rabbeinu. Late ein deya is Moshe Rabbeinu Kohen Gadol. One day it says that Moshe Rabbeinu was a Kohen Gadol. Va'il lo paska kahuna ela mizarei shel Moshe. The pasuk says, "U'Moshe isha alikim bonov yikru al shevet halevi." So this day holds that the kahuna that was taken away from Moshe Rabbeinu because he didn't want to go take the Yidden out of Mitzrayim, that started from the next generation. His children were Leviim, but Moshe Rabbeinu was a kohen, and at certain times a kohen gadol. At zweite day halt, as lein iska in Moshe elashivas me'amiluim bilvad. The other day holds that Moshe only served as kohen for the shivas yimei amiluim, the 7 days of dedication leading up to the Yom Hashmini lamiluim, the dedication of the Mishkan. Is kosher. Now the question becomes: we have two things over here, two issues. Number one, we know that a kohen is not allowed to marry a giyaris. Number two, we know that Moshe Rabbeinu was a kohen, either a part-time kohen or a full-time kohen. So now comes the question: how could Moshe marry the daughter of Yisrael if she's a giyaris and Moshe is a kohen? Now, according to the opinion that Moshe was only a kohen for 7 days, as Moshe is Kohen Gomer, we might be able to squeeze in an answer and say that even for those 7 days, he wasn't a full-fledged Kohen. He served as Kohen, but not all the dinim of Kohen applied to him, and therefore, he was allowed to be married to a Giyaris. Und das, was hat gemerkt, makiv sein Dämmel die Karbonis. So in that case, if he's not a real Kohen, how could he bring the Karbonis? Is this der Fall, weil the Tosfos is Masbir, in the Shivas Yimei Miluim, hat der Mishkan gehat a din bama. Tosfos over there explains that during these 7 days, the Mishkan had a din of a bama meaning a Mizbeach that's outside of Yerushalayim, which a bama, until the Beis Hamikdash was built, anybody could bring a carbon on a bama. And therefore Moshe served those days in a white cloak and not nicht mit die big dekona, weil ein big dekona bebama, because when you're serving in a bama, you don't wear big dekona. Und therefore, is and therefore you could say that Moshe wasn't the real Kohen, and he only served those 7 days as if it was a bama, and therefore he was allowed to marry a Gieris. Aber levad zeis was von Lashon HaGemara le niskahen Moshe chulu is mashmaz b'shivas me'ameluim as a given HaKohen Gomer. First of all, the word is lo niskahen Moshe. Moshe was a Kohen for 7 days. It doesn't say lo shimesh Moshe, or another word that would mean that he served. It says Moshe was a Kohen for 7 days. So that seems to imply that Moshe was a full-fledged Kohen, at least for those 7 days. So besides the fact that that is the implication from those words, it still remains a question. According to the opinion that Moshe for his entire life was a Kohen, how could Moshe Rabbeinu marry a Gioides? So these are our questions. Number one, what was Zimri's question? What was Zimri thinking? He should have known that there's no problem with Moshe marrying a Gioides. Moshe marrying a Midyanis because she was actually a Gioides. Number two, why doesn't anyone answer Zimri's questions? And number three is our question: how could Moshe Rabbeinu marry Sipori? He's a Kohen. So in Siv Gimel and Dalid, he's going to suggest that these two questions are actually intertwined, and one will answer the other. And he's going to suggest that Zimri's question was, how could you, Moshe, who's a Kohen, marry a Gioides? Zimri knew that if not for this din, Zimri wasn't asking that she was a Gentile woman. He knew that she wasn't his Geyer. His question was, how could you marry her if you're a Kohen? And we're going to see if that works and how it works. Seemingly we could suggest that these two questions, the question in Sif Aleph about what was Zimri asking, and the question in Sif Beis, how could Yisrael marry a Kohen? How could Moshe, who's a Kohen, marry a Gioides, are interconnected. Who allowed you to marry the daughter of Yisrael? Zimri was not implying the prohibition of marriage with a Gentile woman, nor dem isur Gioides lekoyin. He was referring to the prohibition of a Gioides marrying a Kohen. So maybe that's a suggestion that Yisrael is saying. Zimri is saying to Moshe Rabbeinu, how could you marry a Gioides if you're a Kohen? You're going to say, how does it fit? Zimri is saying that I should be able to marry a Goita because he married a Gioides. I mean, how does it flow? Und der Sheiches zwischen dem Isser mit dem was mit Yonis is Asura, and the flow of Zimri's question, the connection between the fact that Moshe is married to a Gioides and that suggesting that a Midyanis should be Asur. Im Tamer Zu Asur Bas Yisir Chulu. What's the connection now between Cosby Bas Tzur, who is a Gentile woman, and Bas Yisrael, who is a Jewish woman, just a convert? Is in them is as follows. Because the whole reason why the Gioides is prohibited is because she comes from people that are immersed in immorality, and therefore she goes under the category of a Zaina. Thus, in other words, Zimri is saying, if this Midyanis is prohibited to be married to me because she's a Gentile woman, then for the same reason, she should not be allowed to be married to Moshe Rabbeinu, even though she was Niskayer, because she still has the same classification of Bo Mina Akum. She's coming from the same people, and for the same reason that I can't marry Cosby Bastur because she's an Aramish, she's an idol worshiper, not an idol worshiper, a Shtufim Bezimas, someone that is immersed in immorality. Also, the Tzipera should not be allowed to be married to Moshe even after the Gerus because she's in the category of a Zaina, which is Asura to Moshe Rabbeinu. So seemingly we have an answer. Now we understand the whole story. Zimri comes and to taunt, to challenge Moshe Rabbeinu, he says, can I be with this woman? And if you're going to say that I can be, which means that you're calling out the fact that she's not a Yid and where she comes from, you have the same issue. You are married to a woman that is usher to you because of her background. How could you be married to her? Aber lefiza bleibt schwer. So the Rebbe is going to say now that this does not answer our questions properly. Because then we're going to come from the other direction. Was is Taki di tshuva after Taina? What's the answer? How Taki is Moshe Rabbeinu married to a Giyodis? And why didn't we give Zimri the answer? So if you're going to say that Zimri is challenging Moshe on the fact that he's a Kohen married to a Giyodis, the question becomes, how could he marry a Giyodis? And if there's an explanation, why don't we just give it to Zimri? So in Sif Daled, we're going to suggest two things, and ultimately that'll lead us to the actual answer in Sif Hey. So we might be able to answer the question like this. Yisro's Taina was, how could the Kohen be married to a Giyodis? Now, in the Gemara in Shabbos, it says that there was three things that Moshe did on his own, without Hashem telling him to do so, and the Eibishter agreed with all of them. For example, one of them was that he added a day of preparation for Shavuos. That's the context of the question the Gemara is talking about over there. And another thing is Piresh ben Aisha. One of the three things is that he separated from his wife. Now you can't ask Moshe who allowed you to be married to a Bas Yisrael. Technically, Moshe didn't say this, but he could have said, you're asking why I'm married to a Bas Yisrael, I'm not married to her. And the fact that he was separated, if he's still married, just separated, is not enough to remove the prohibition of a kohen with a giyodis. In the end of Parshas Ba'aleischa, where it speaks about Miriam's complaint to Aaron that Moshe separated from his wife, this is where we're introduced to this idea. So Rashi says, Al Eides Aisha, Al Eides Gerusha. There's two Rashis. One about the woman, and Rashi says, what about the woman? About the divorce from the woman. Ki Isha Kushis Lakach, because he took a Isha Kushis, as Rashi explains over there, a very, very beautiful woman. Va'ata Gersha. In other words, because what was Miriam's complaint? That he married the beautiful woman. The Rashi explains, Va'ata Gersha, the fact that he married her when he did, but now he divorced her. So we see that Rashi both times uses the words Gerushin, which is more than separation, more than Prisha. Das says Rashi Lerin, das ist nicht nur was Pirish ben Isha, but Rashi brings us dart that up. Not only did he separate himself from her, Prisha Be'alma, which is merely a separation, but they still remain married, they're saying Gerushin. Moshe divorced her. So the answer to Zimri's question is, I'm not married to her. You want to know how I can be married to a Bas Kohen, to a Bas Midyan? I'm not married to her. Then in that case, why doesn't Moshe say that? Why doesn't Moshe say, listen, I'm not married? Von deswegen haben wir das nicht geantwortet Zimrinnen. But nevertheless, we find that not only Moshe, but nobody answers this to Zimri. When hat gefragt, Bas Yisrael meitiru lecha, when he asks this question, who allowed you to marry Yisrael's daughter? Weil, wie mevur in Divrei Chazal, it's explained in Chazal, hat keiner von dem nicht gewusst. Nobody knew about it. Moshe separated or divorced from his wife, and nobody knew about it. Bis als euch Miriam hat sich davon wusst, erst von Eldo de Mädel mistabem bemachene. Miriam, who's the sister of Moshe Rabbeinu, family, she had no idea that Moshe had separated from his wife until the story of after Moshe Rabbeinu gave a nevuah to the 70 Zekanim, and then Eldad and Medad were going around and saying nevuah. Und Sipera had gesagt, Sipera said, I feel bad for the wives of these people, because if they become Nevi'im, if they become part of the world of prophecy, then they're going to divorce their wives, like my husband divorced me. And Miriam is sitting there; she had no idea, and immediately she goes running to Aaron and she says, "Did you know? Why would he do this?" Etc. Etc. As we know the story from Parshas Ba'aleischa. So, no one else even knew that Moshe was not married. anymore. So therefore no one's going to say, hey, hold it, he's not married. And Moshe himself didn't say anything. Why not? Varum. Since Moshe Rabbeinu did it on his own, Moshe felt he was doing an extra thing, something that might look a little arrogant. And if Hashem told him to do it, then it's a mitzvah of Hashem, then it's not a secret. But if he's doing it on his own, he felt that due to his humility, he felt that no one has to know about it. So nobody else, Moshe never told anyone, because he felt it was his own chumrah, his own stringency, not something that he has to go publicize, and therefore for the same reason he didn't want to answer this to Zimri, because it was none of anybody's business. So now we have another suggestion. So maybe Zimri's taina was take, why did Moshe marry a Giyaris? And the answer to the question is he wasn't married to her anymore. And the reason why no one said anything was because Moshe Rabbeinu didn't want to say anything, and therefore nobody knew anything, and therefore no one said anything. However, this explanation does not hold ground. It's not sufficient. Vile. First of all, first of all, Rashi holds, and Rashi says this in the end of Parshas Balak, that when Hashem was talking to Miriam about the greatness of Moshe, he says, Pe el pe adaber boy, I speak to him face to face. So Rashi says, I'm the one who told him to separate from his wife. So, when did he do that? When he said, after Matan Torah, he said everyone should go and you stay here with me. So everyone separated from their wives for 3 days before Matan Torah. So now after Matan Torah, everyone was able to return to their wives. But Hashem says to Moshe, you stay with me. Stay separated. And if it was a commandment from Hashem, then it's not considered arrogant or not humble to tell people. If anything that comes from Hashem is something that people want to hear about, and when someone does what Hashem wants of them, then it's a nice thing. It's an okay thing to tell people. So that's our first question. That the foundation of the answer was that since he didn't meet Daitoi on his own, therefore no one knew about it. And since no one knew about it, therefore no one said anything. But if it was a tzivay Hashem, then we can expect that other people did know about it. And then the question becomes, why didn't Moshe say anything, or why didn't other people say anything to Zimri? But in addition to that, we have another question. The Sibbe from Prishas Moshe and Isha Zokman, as es is der Farbe says given an Novi. The Rashi bringt up von Sifri, as Sipera hat gesagt, Oil in Sheisein Shel Elam. The reason that, let's go back a second, the reason that Moshe separates from his wife is because he was a Navi. As Rashi brings from the Sifri, that Sipera said, whoa, or I feel bad for the wives of these people. If they will become connected, involved with prophecy, they're going to separate from their wives. So, according to this, the issue here, why does Moshe Rabbeinu separate from his wife? Because he was a Navi. If Moshe is not allowed to be married to a kohen, and that is to a Giyaris, and that is the taina of Zimri, and the answer is Taka wasn't married to her, then why does Moshe Rabbeinu wait until Hashem says V'atapoya moidi modi? Why does the Medrash imply that it's the issue is because in this kakim in Nevuah that the only reason that Moshe Rabbeinu separated from Tzipora was because of the fact that he was a Navi, if the real reason is because he was a kohen and he was not to marry a Giyaris? In other words, the fact that we ignore this detail in all the other parts of the story implies that Moshe Rabbeinu was allowed to be married to Tzipora. The fact that he separated from her was for a different reason, because he was a Navi and he wanted to be a holy person, or he needed to be a holy person. Hashem told him to be a holy person. So, we now go back to our original question. It can't be that Moshe was not allowed to be married to Tzipora as a kohen to a Geiris. So we now go back to our original question. What is Zimri's Taina? What is the answer to Zimri's Taina? And why Taka is Moshe Rabbeinu allowed to be married to Tzipora if he's a kohen and she's a Geiris? So in Sif Hey, he's going to answer the question, but it's going to incorporate some of the details that we've established up until here, but it's going to bring them all together to understand what the halacha is. There beer in them. So here's the beer. A stating in Mishnah, there's a Mishnah in Yavamis that says, Ires, Esa Almana, Kohen Hadit. If a regular Kohen got engaged to an Almana, this is referring to the fact that he was Mekadesher. In other words, there's Kiddushin and there's Nisuin, which Kiddushin is the today we call it engaged, or when we do the chasna, it's the putting on of the ring. It's making a kinyan to say that this is going to be my wife, but they aren't yet married, they aren't yet living together in the same house. So here we have a regular kohen that was me'ares and got engaged. He made a kinyan with an almana. A kohen is allowed to marry an almana. A kohen gadol is not allowed to marry an almana. But before he had a chance to finish the nisuin, before to bring her into his home, so to speak, nisman is kohen gadol. He was appointed as a kohen gadol. So the question is, do I say that because he already started and it was engaged to her, and engaged doesn't just mean the way engaged means today, it means actually a kinyan, a kiddushin. So do we say that because he already did kiddushin when she was mutter to him, he's allowed to be married? Or do we say that because he didn't do the nisuin yet, so therefore he didn't actually complete the marriage, so therefore now he's a kohen gadol, he can't marry her? So the Mishnah says yichnois. He brings her into his house, he's allowed to finish the marriage because he started out in a permissible manner, therefore he's allowed to complete his marriage with this woman. Und die Gemara learned this up from Pasuk Yikach Isha. The Gemara says, how do I know this? Because it says Yikach Isha. As we bow the Yikach Isha, the Eidusin is given beheter, that because the Yikach, which is the Likuchin, the Eidusin was permissible, Meger lechatchila endikin de lekicha ukenes the almana, so he's allowed to complete this transaction and bring this almana into his house. So we see from here that if someone started something beheter, even if later it would have become mu'asr, but once it was done beheter, it's beheter. He says, so how much more so does this apply in our case? We need not the Edison. The Reich the Nisuin and given beheter when Moshe Rabbeinu married Tzipora, it was all, even the Nisuin was done properly. As ich nach dem, the Moshe is given a kohen, is bas Yisrael mu given metereslei, Chadzi is given a geiris. So now even afterward, even though later Moshe becomes a kohen gadol or a kohen, it doesn't matter. Because when he married her, he was allowed to be married to her. They're allowed to remain married. So that's the answer to the question: how could Moshe be married to a Geiris? Because when he married her, he wasn't a kohen. So now you could answer you could ask a question. Das was Moshe hat chasna gehabt mit Tzipora beheter is doch kein Farmaten Teire. 1 second. When did Moshe Rabbeinu marry her beheter? Before Matan Teire. Und yes, als Eden da ben damals gehabt hat den von Bnei Noach. Und sie ist dann überhaupt nicht gewesen der Geder alle Kirche von nach Matan Teire. So since at that time they were still, they had the status of non-Jews, and therefore they couldn't have gotten married with a proper marriage according to Teire. Muss man doch sagen, als nach Matan Teire hat bei Eden gedarf sein mechadisch kiddushin ule kicha den ishesein al Teire. So it must be that after they received the Teire and they became Yidden, they should have seemingly had to redo their kiddushin, their lekuchin, their erisin, and their kiddushin and their nisuin. They should have to do everything over again. Is the Chadar Kushel Duchte. Wie hat Moshe gemerkt, Mekadeh sein Tzipora nach Matan Teire? What he did before Matan Teire is insufficient, because at that point it wasn't a halachic marriage, because they weren't Yidden and the Teire wasn't given yet. And now that the Teire was given, and now they are halachic Yidden, now they have to have a halachic marriage. is this nitke in kasha? This is not a question, for two reasons. Number one, the remarriage, the renewing of the vows, was certainly done immediately after Matan Torah. Ubemela, b'negei Moshe, is das given eder as given akayin b'mei hamiluim noch hakamas hamishkan. Moshe does not become a kohen until almost a year later. This is when they receive the Torah in Chodesh Sivan, and Moshe doesn't become a kohen until the next Nisan, when or the end of Adar, when you have Shivas Mei Hamiluim. He's afilu im vet annehmen as later day as Moshe kol yomov kohenaya hat sein Kohuna sich angegeben taken from Matan Torah. So if you talk about the opinion that Moshe was a kohen for 7 days, it's not a question at all, because the remarriage was immediately after Matan Torah, before Moshe became a kohen. So she was a giyaris, he was a regular yid. They were both regular yid, and they can get married, no problem. I feel like even if you go with the opinion that Moshe was a kohen all of his life, so his Kohuna began right after Matan Torah. Still not a question, for a totally different reason. For the following reason. The pasuk says a man from the house of Levi, referring to Amram, went and he took the daughter of Levi, which is referring to Yecheved. So the Gemara asks the question, why Vayikach? Should have said Vehechzer. They were married before, and they'd separated because of the Gzeira of Parei, and then they decided to remarry. Vehechzer as Bas Levi. Vayikach. Why does the Darshan to Gemara, the Gemara answers, She'asala Maisa Likuchin. He performed with her the act of Likuchin, the act of Kiddushin. He got engaged to her, Al Pi Torah. First, the Pshat in them is, what does it mean? As Amram hat ihr Mekadesh gegeben mit Likuchin von nach Matan Torah. Amram married, or was Mekadesh, betrothed Yecheved with a halachic, a post-Matan Torah halachic betrothal. And before we continue where this is going, a very beautiful explanation in the Rambam here in the brackets. There means that in Mefarshim Masber was the Rambam sagt, Mitzrayim nitztava Amram b'mitzvos Yisraelis. In Hilchas Malachim, the Rambam is says that how the mitzvahs began. There were 6 mitzvahs that were given to Adam Rishon. Then another mitzvah was given to Noach, Ever, and Achai, and this became 7 mitzvahs for Noach. And then there was the mitzvah of Bris that was given to Avram Avinu, plus Shacharis. Then there was Yitzchak. Then there was Yankiv. Then there was Shabbos and Mara. And then he says that in Mitzrayim, Nitztava Amram mitzvahs Yisraelis, that Mitzrayim Amram was commanded with additional mitzvahs besides the ones that they already had. But the Chayres just didn't move on. So some of the Neisei Kalim or the Mefarshim and the Rambam ask, Vu gefimen as Nitztava Amram mitzvahs Yisraelis. The Kesef Mishnah, I think, asks this question: Where do you see that Amram had more mitzvahs? But according to this, this is the answer. It's actually brought in one of the Mefarshim on the Rambam. He says, "No, das is the mitzvah for kiddushin." Was in Mitzrayim. He brings this Gemara from Seita that Seita. From Seita, that Yikach ish mi bas Levi, Yikach ish mi bas Levi, by Yelech ish mi bas Levi, Yikach es bas Levi, and he brings this Gemara Asalam Aisel Likuchin, and he says this mitzvah of kiddushin, this mitzvah of marriage, is what the Rambam is talking about. That Amram had the mitzvah of kiddushin. So now we know that even before Matan Torah, the Yidden already had the mitzvah of Kiddushin. They knew how to perform a marriage even before they used to give the Torah. So therefore it was not necessary to do a new Kiddushin after Matan Torah. The previous marriage remained intact, remained valid, even after Matan Torah. And the feast says, move on. As the Yikach Ish of Moshe Rabbeinu is given beheter, therefore Moshe Rabbeinu married Tzipora. It was beheter. Vibaldas is given far Matan Torah, and before Matan Torah there was no issue of marrying a midyanis or certain or a giyaris. He did not have to remarry Tzipora after Matan Torah, and therefore he was following. Therefore, later he becomes Taka a Kohen. But by the time he becomes a Kohen, he's already married to Tzipora legitimately, and therefore he's allowed to remain married to her. So this answers our question in Siv Beis. The question in Siv Beis was, how was Moshe allowed to be married to Tzipora if Moshe is a Kohen and Tzipora is a Giyoris? And the answer is because when Moshe married her, he was allowed to marry her. And the Mishnah tells us that if a person married someone in a permissible way, then even if later something changes, but once the marriage was done properly, it remains intact. And therefore, even after Matan Torah, when she became a Giyoris, and Moshe Rabbeinu became a Kohen, they're already married. And there's no need to redo the marriage because we are also using this limud of that Amram Asa B'Maaseh Likuchin, that the mitzvah of Kiddushin was given before Matan Torah. Now let's go back to Zimri. The Mitkim Mazbezayin Alevas is given the Taina from Zimri Bas Yisrei Meitir. We're going to explain what was Zimri's challenge to Moshe Rabbeinu. Why did he ask the question, how could you marry Tzipora? And number two, now we'll also understand why Moshe did not respond to Yisrei's Taina, to Zimri's Taina. Zimri hat nicht gehalten von der Yalfusa, von Teresh Valpeh, von Yikach Isha Hanal. Und the Shitasi hat Moshe gemus megaras in Bas Yisrei. This whole heter is meyused on this Mishnah in Yevamis that says that because it says Yikach Isha, so if the lekicha was proper, then even if later something changes, they're allowed to stay married. Zimri did not agree with that limud. He felt that that Moshe Rabbeinu now was a Kohen and she was now a Giyoris. He had an obligation to divorce her. So this is what Zimri comes and says: if I can't marry this Arami, this Midyanis, how could you be married to a Giyoris? The Giyoris is the Chba min ha'akum, and akum was Shtufei Zima. So if I can't marry this akum, why could you be married to an akum even after the Geros? Even after the Geros, because you're a Kohen, and you're going to say Yikach Isha. I don't agree with Yikach Isha. You can't be married to someone once you become a Kohen and she's a Giyoris. You have to part ways. Now, why doesn't Moshe respond? Moshe could have said Yikach Isha. Moshe did can't answer him with the limit for Yikach Isha. Moshe could not answer this. While der din is as a Talmud Chacham was is mehr halacha und is an Agea Bedavar is a nitba gleibt to Shas Meister to sagen kach kibalti. So the din is that a Talmud Chacham that is teaching a halacha, if he is an Agea Bedavar, if the halacha that he's ruling will affect his personal life, then he is not believed to say kach kibalti. This is what I received from my Rebbe's or from the Eibishter. U'meish is doch an Agea Bedavar bas Yisrei mihi tira lecha. And this is relevant to Moshe. The whole challenge was the fact that Moshe was married to a Giyoris. So therefore, Moshe couldn't say anything. In the order 62, he says, why didn't anyone else say anything? So he answers that it's possible that Moshe hadn't yet taught this to all the other Yidden. So the other Yidden didn't either know the limud of Yikach Isha. Or you could say Nisalma Mimenu Halacha applies to this as well. That the Yidden didn't know the halacha of this halacha. They were taught it, but they forgot it. But so therefore, now before we get to the end of the sif, there's a brackets over here, very gishmak, brings in aside a parenthetical idea. We see a similar thing where Moshe doesn't answer the question fully, but machlekes of Kerach. In addition to his challenge to the kahuna of Aaron, he also came with other questions and claims. A house, a room that is full of sifrei Torah, is it chayiv to have a mezuzah on the door? Or a question with regards to tcheles. Talis or kulot tcheles mashat echayev. If the talis, the entire fabric of the talis, is made out of tcheles wool, does it have to have tzitzis on the corners? We do not find that Moshe answers the questions. In other words, he says that you need to have a mezuzah. He says that you need to have tzitzis. He answers yes, but he doesn't go into the reason why. He doesn't elaborate why. And he only goes on and tells them that the Eibishter is going to created a hole in the ground which can swallow them up. When the Asbar is canal, Moshe is going to negeh b'davar. Moshe was negeh b'davar. First of all, he was Aaron's brother, and Aaron's kahuna was being challenged. Also, really, his godless, his greatness was also being challenged. When the Pharaoh to Saivin had given back them, so even if he would to give the explanations and the reasonings why the mezuzah is chayiv, why the room is chayiv mezuzah, or the talis is chayiv and tzitzis, he would not have been believed. So therefore, there was no reason for Moshe to go into it. And based on the same concept over here, that a person who's a Talmid Chacham, who's meir halacha, he's teaching halacha, if he's in a negeh b'davar, he is not believed to say kach kibalti. So now we have the answer to all of our questions. Why was Moshe allowed to marry Tzipora? Because Yikach Isha, when he married her, the marriage was legitimate. What was Zimri's taina? Zimri's taina was, how could you be married to a Giyadas if you're a Kohen? And the answer to the question is because of Yikach Isha. But Zimri didn't hold of Yikach Isha, or he didn't know of Yikach Isha. And the reason Moshe doesn't say anything is because he was in a negeh b'davar. Now we have the lesson. Very short and powerful lesson. Not always do we have to try to answer people's questions. Sometimes the whole goal of the question is to permit a non-Jewish woman. If his purpose is a person wants to know because he's for the sake of heaven, for the right reasons, then even if he's a fool, you should answer him. Then but if he's coming to ask a question in Torah with the goal of permitting something that the Torah prohibits, then the answer is do not answer the fool in his foolishness. Der Weg zu menatzeach seiner Samenagid of Torah is nicht durch Meshakal v'Tarya, nor mitat tekif as is on the Mailam mitam v'das. The way to win over this type of opponent is not through debate, but through a firmness that supersedes logic. And similar as applies to every single individual. When the Melech Zaken uchsil the Yitzhara kum mevalvel zayin, when the Yitzhara, who's called the old and foolish king, comes to confuse you, we should not try to debate with the Yitzhara. You have to right away act with firmness. Drag him into the yeshiva, learn with him, do something, but don't get into an argument and in a debate with the Yitzhara. This is also Pinchas' anhaga, where he acted with zealotry, with zealousness. He didn't debate with Zimri. Because the din is, if you come to ask the question, you don't tell him to kill the perpetrator. No. He was avenging the covet of the Eibishter, and he actually risked his life to kill Zimri. Because we know the Gemara says that if Zimri had killed him back, Zimri would be potter because he was a roidef. Pinchas was a roidef. So Zimri could have tried to kill Pinchas, and there was no way to defend him. So Pinchas was Mesa Nefesh. Why? Because he was Bikan Oyes Kinasi. He was being zealous for the Eibishter's covet, and therefore there was no debate, there was no talking. He did what had to be done. And in Sivches, he's going to apply this to Yud Beis Tammuz. The Chag HaGeula from Yud Beis Gimel Tammuz is Chol B'Rei Vashanim and the Vach from Parshas Balak. The Chag HaGeula most of the years comes out to be on the calendar in the week of Parshas Balak, as it does in this year that we're learning the Sikha together. This idea is connected to the Chag HaGeula. The Anhaga from the Rebbe and the Balak Gula Vasimcha is given in a nefel from Bekanah Yaskinasi. Also, the Anhaga of the Frierdiker Rebbe was in a manner of Bekanoi to the zealousness, nit guckendig auf die Teines von gewissen Menschen, as in der Tag Chiyuv, sich zu meisen nefesh sein an kol tzad v'shal, despite the claims of some of the people that there's no Torah obligation to risk your life for every step that we're taking, is by Balagula v'asimcha gewender bekanoyas kin asi. By the Balagula, by the Frierdiker Rebbe, he was defending the covenant of the Eibishter. Balak says the Eibishter says ach kin asi hat sich noch anan meisen nefesh gewen bepeil of abat sater v'yadus. Because he was doing something for the Eibishter, he therefore continuously risked his life in reality, in actuality, to spread Torah and Yiddishkeit. The Mesiris Nefesh can time become my final. There's two ways. Two types of Mesiris Nefesh. Umayhem, Aleph, the Parsha Seinu, nit durch Nasi Ader. In our Parsha, the Mesiris Nefesh was not implemented by the Nasi. The Nasi Ader is again Moshe. Moshe was the Nasi. And because, I don't know if it's because, but together with the fact that it wasn't Moshe Rabbeinu, it was also in an Eifen from Gevura, it was in a manner of severity. Was the Fargefimen as Pinchas, hu Elio, hat gesagt, Kanoi kinesi lashem lakitzvais, und hat nit gefunden as chus afiden. Then we find later on that Pinchas becomes Eliyahu Hanavi, and Eliyahu Hanavi says, I defended the Eibishter. And he could not find a schus for Yidden, because since he was coming from a place of Gevura, there was no patience, there was no place, there was no kindness to seek the positivity within the Yidden. So that's one oifen that was done not by the Nasi Adoir, and it was done through Gevura, based by Balak Gula v'Asimcha, or in the way that it was done by the Frierdiker Rebbe. Bekan oyes ki Nasi the Nasi Adoir alein. It was the Nasi himself that did it. The truth we could say, before we go on to the chesed part, the truth is we could say that also by Pinchas, even though he was the one who acted it out, but the koyach came from Moshe Rabbeinu, who was the Nasi Ader. What happens is that Pinchas says to Moshe Rabbeinu, didn't you teach us that Abayel Akusis Kanoim Pagan Boy? So Moshe says to him, Kraina the Ignis, the reader of the letter, he's the one, he should be the agent to implement what it says. In other words, you're right, that's what the halacha is. Now go and do it. And with that he gave Pinchas the koyach to fight, to avenge the covenant of the Eibishter. And as we started by the Balak Gula v'Asimcha, he himself was the one who engaged in the Bekanayas Kinasi, and it wasn't an Eifel for Chasadim. By the Frierdiker Rebbe, it was in a manner of kindness, not Gevura. The Balak Gula v'Asimcha gebeten sein Vater, der Rebbe is Paseiden, as eine Siyos, as ein Bechesed of Rachmim. As it's been related many times that before the Rebbe Rashab passed away and he gave over the Nesiyos to the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe asked that it should be b'chesed b'racham, it should be with kindness and with mercy. It should go easy. It was a very difficult time in Russia at the time. It was right after or during the Bolshevik Revolution, the First World War, and it was times were very, very difficult, and communism had started, and the Frierdiker Rebbe asked it should be b'chesed b'racham. So we must know that everything that the Frierdiker Rebbe did was an inifin of chesed. Der uftu, and what's the difference if it's bechesed b'gvura? Der uftu as eich an inyan von kanayas kinasi ver durchgeführt in an eifin von der teiv ayin u yevedach bechesed b'rachmim. That even something of bekanayas kinasi, avenging, defending the covenant, which sounds like a more harsh approach, when it's bechesed b'rachmim, even the kanos is done in a manner of teiv ayin u yevedach, a good eye is the one who is blessed, and it's bechesed b'rachmim. May we merit that all of the Mesiris Nefesh of the Frierdiker Rebbe, of the Rebbe, should end this galus now bechesed b'rachmim.